there. I'm going to spend some time today talking you through a variety of aspects of Mexican society. We're going to run through some major sources of social cleavage, and then I'm going to talk about two specific issues. One, the Zapatista Uprising in the South in 1994, and second, some issues of gender in Mexican politics and society. So, starting with social cleavages, which are those sources of internal divisions within a society. We're often thinking about race, class, ethnicity, region, nationality, religion, that kind of thing. Ethnicity is an important source of social identity in Mexican politics, although it's also somewhat difficult to quantify. About 15% of Mexico's population identifies as indigenous, which is to say dating their roots back to before the arrival of Europeans in the early 16th century. It's difficult. You'll find different numbers trying to quantify Mexico's indigenous population because identity, as you will find out if you dig into it, is a really fuzzy concept. And so you'll see numbers ranging anywhere from like 5 to 20%. But the roughly in that range of people identify themselves as indigenous in some way or another. It's worth noting that the PRI really promoted this idea during the period of one-party rule, that ethnic distinctions weren't that important in Mexico, that basically all Mexicans shared this one mestizo identity. That's a term that's not super commonly used in Mexico, although you might have heard of it in, for instance, an AP US history class. And it is true that there, over the course of the 500 years since European colonization, that there has been a tremendous degree of mixing between Europeans, between indigenous people, between people of African origin in Mexico and elsewhere in Latin America. And so that's not a totally invented idea. But when the PRI promoted this idea that we are all mestizos, we are all mixed, we all have this uniquely blended Mexican ethnic heritage, part of that was based in fact, and part of that reflected the PRI's desire for everybody to just get along and kind of be quiet about their desire for autonomy. So it's just worth noting the indigenous population is concentrated in Mexico's south. It is more likely to be poor. It is more likely to be rural. It is more likely to be less educated. And so there's some significant dimensions of disadvantage associated with indigeneity in Mexico. Number two, and as I said, overlapping that, is socioeconomic class. Economic liberalization in the last 40 or 50 years has produced a growing middle class in Mexico. But the benefits of liberalization are, of course, not spread evenly throughout the country. And in particular, what you see in Mexico is increasing regional inequality. The North tends to overall benefit more from economic liberalization than the South because it's proximate to the United States, which is Mexico's major export market and the major destination for foreign direct investment into Mexico. And so you start to see increasing regional inequality, all of which will come to a head with the Zapatista Uprising, which I'll talk about in a moment. Related to that, of course, is region. The north of Mexico, as I said, is more industrialized. It has benefited more from foreign investment in the era of economic liberalization, especially after the implementation of NAFTA in 1994. The south tends to be more rural, more agricultural, as I said, more indigenous, overall less economically developed. And so there's been some increasing tensions which between the north and the south in Mexico. And you can kind of see that play out in voting behavior, knowing that the PAN in the three-party period tended to be stronger and more popular in the north, whereas the PRD, with its more left-wing politics and its urging that people focus on that the state focus on remedying poverty tends to be more popular in the South. And that's a major piece of AMLO's base of support as well. Finally, religion. Religion operates a little differently in Mexican politics because it tends to be a source of unifying identity, what we know as a cross-cutting cleavage, which is to say you and I might have different ethnicity, we might live in a different region, we might speak a different language, but we're likely to have the same religion. About 80% of Mexicans are Roman Catholic. That's a legacy of Spanish conquest, which actively promoted a lot of Catholic missionary activity. That remains the case today. There is a growing population of evangelical Protestants in Mexico, and we'll see that in a couple of other case study countries as well, but it remains overwhelmingly Roman Catholic, and that tends to be a source of common identity and also of some relative social conservative trends in Mexican politics, which we'll talk about when we get to gender. A couple maps to look at real quick. This first one shows you the distribution of Mexico's indigenous population by state. We're looking here at numbers, not at percentages, but you can see here that Mexico's indigenous population is heavily concentrated in the south and also in the Yucatan Peninsula. That's this area jutting out in the east here. One other map to look at shows you gross domestic product per capita by state. As a reminder, that's just kind of the that's a really, really rough and ready, easily comparable measure of just kind of how productive an economy is, how many resources are available for people in an area. Darker green equals higher GDP per capita. And here you can see that with the exception of Mexico City, that kind of southern central small area in dark green you see, Mexico's richer states tend to be concentrated in the north as a result of the United States' increasing economic influence in an era of economic liberalization. A lot of these social cleavages are really going to come to a head and be displayed in a 1994 event known as the Zapatista Uprising. So I'm going to talk you through those events briefly, although there's a lot more that you can learn about this if you are interested. And I'll post one or two resources related to that in the description for this video. So on January 1st, 1994, a group known as the Zapatista Army of National Liberation, the EZLN, or I'm just going to call them the Zapatistas, rises up in the southern state of Chiapas, which is one of those states where you saw on the previous map, we see a higher concentration of indigenous people in Mexico and also a lower GDP per capita in Mexico. And they take over government centers and office buildings in several towns throughout Chiapas, and they declare essentially war against the Mexican state. They're calling for the dismissal of the president and what they perceive as the restoration of true democracy in Mexico. This is a predominantly indigenous movement. It identifies itself explicitly as being a movement for indigenous people and for indigenous peasants, although you'll see some non-indigenous people of different socioeconomic backgrounds represented in the movement as well. And so the function of this movement is to try and restore power to indigenous people. They take their name from a guy named Emiliano Zapata, who was a revolutionary leader during the period of the Mexican Revolution, who was one of the more radical leaders of that movement. And he explicitly called for restoring economic power, restoring land rights, restoring political autonomy to indigenous people, and particularly farmers in Mexico's south. So there's some historical inspiration there. In some ways, they're framing themselves as trying to fulfill the more radical promises of the Mexican Revolution. What are the Zapatistas mad about? A couple of big picture things. One is what they perceive as the long-standing marginalization of indigenous people. They are very keenly aware that levels of economic development in predominantly indigenous areas are lower. They are very keenly aware that the state is not necessarily protecting their rights to linguistic autonomy and distinctiveness, or to self-governance, or importantly, to be able to work their own land in the way that they want. A central principle of the Mexican Revolution was this idea of land reform, that land, particularly in the South, had become too concentrated in the hands of these massive landowners, and that the ordinary peasants who worked the land were having their labor exploited and didn't have the right to profit from their own labor on Mexico's gigantic farms. And so the Constitution that is enacted in 1917 and that ends the Mexican Revolution, that is the culmination of the Mexican Revolution, Article 27 of that Constitution contains some pretty extensive provisions which basically say the resources of the Mexican state are the property of the Mexican people, and the state can intervene in order to take those resources away from private for-profit companies or from wealthy landowners and to redistribute them to the people. In the more radical periods of pre-rule, that article was invoked in order to break up these large land holdings and to distribute them into these communal farms known as ejidos, which could be run by small groups of peasant farmers. The idea being that the people who work the land should have some more control over how it's done and how profits are going to be distributed from that. In the 1990s, the pre-government backs away from land reform. They actually implement some changes to the Constitution that allow for the government to break up the ejidos and to turn that communally held land into private property. And so the Zapatistas are concerned that this reform is going to lead to a return to the more exploitative patterns of land ownership and farming that had previously existed. What's going to bring that to a head is the implementation of NAFTA. And in fact, the Zapatista rebellion begins on the same day as NAFTA is set to take effect, January 1st, 1994. That's not a coincidence. Southern farmers in Mexico are very, very keenly aware that once markets are opened up, once tariffs on imports from the United States are lowered, they're not going to be able to compete with the flood of really cheap corn that is produced in the United States. They realize that Mexican consumers are going to start importing much cheaper corn from the United States rather than buying it from Mexican farmers. And so they know that they stand to lose out in a very serious way from economic liberalization. And that's kind of the spark that lights the fire. But there are much deeper seated, both cultural, political, and economic grievances that underlie this movement. The results are mixed, kind of depends how you see it. On the one hand, the military rebellion lasts, I think, 10 or 11 days. And so the armed part of the Zapatista uprising is put down relatively quickly. The Mexican military is going to move in with tremendous force. And so that idea that they're going to march all the way to Mexico City and demand that the president resign certainly does not come to fruition. On the other hand, the Zapatistas are surprisingly popular within Mexico. Their leaders are really good at working the media, at achieving public sympathy. And so a lot of Mexican people actually say, well, you know what, they might have a point. Maybe this administration's policies have overlooked this large group of people. Second, the government is going to promise, ultimately, after a period of 2 years of negotiation, the government is going to reach a settlement with the Zapatistas in which they promise that they're going to provide some more protections for indigenous communities, that they're going to allow them a greater degree of self-governance, that they're going to provide them with more extensive access to the resources of the state. The document in which that agreement is reached is known as the San Andres Accords. That said, big asterisk on that, because to this day, the Mexican government has implemented that agreement in a way that the Zapatistas have explicitly said is unacceptable to them. They have watered down their promises, and that in particular, those promises of restoring autonomy in land have not been fulfilled. And so today, the Zapatistas continue to pursue autonomy. They are no longer particularly interested in engaging directly with the Mexican government. They have kind of given up hopes explicitly for land reform, but they actually do govern a number of communities in Chiapas state. And I'll put a link in this video to a profile of one of those communities governed by the Zapatistas. Suffice it to say, it's a very, very different political model from the Mexican federal government, and also from really anything else that you're going to talk about in this course. So it's worth noting, it's worth looking at the Zapatista uprising, not just because of its sort of long-term results, but also because I think it's a really neat illustration of the cleavages of ethnicity and race, of region, and of socioeconomic development that continue to be really relevant in Mexican politics. Last issue to talk about is gender. I'm going to focus on two major issues for women in Mexico. The first of which is electoral quotas, those rules that say how many political parties, how many women have to be nominated for office by political parties. It's worth noting that so Mexico overall has much more representation for women in its legislature today, and also some of the most aggressive electoral quota laws trying to ensure that women will be elected to public office in the world. Latin America in general tends to be ahead of the rest of the world in this issue of having electoral quotas to guarantee women's representation, and Mexico really kind of leads the pack among Latin American countries. And it's worth noting that the context in which these quota laws are introduced and then repeatedly reformed in the last 30 years is one of broader democratization. Remember that starting in the 1990s, Mexico keeps implementing more and more legislative reforms that are designed to make the country more democratic as a whole. And one of the effects of that process is going to be to make it possible for people advocating for greater representation for women to try and sneak their preferred reforms to the electoral laws into that process. So that's going to be quite helpful for people who are arguing that the laws should guarantee more representation for women. So the first electoral quota in Mexican law is introduced in 1996, and it's pretty weak. It really just says we recommend that political parties nominate, I think, 30% women for legislative offices, for elective office at the federal level. But over the course of time, that threshold is repeatedly increased, so it is turned into an actual requirement. Then the number is bumped up from 30% to 40%. Today, it's actually written into Mexico's constitution that political parties are required to ensure what is called gender parity, I think that's the term in the constitution, in their nominations for office, not just at the federal level, but also at the local level and the state level. And so today, what you see Mexican political parties doing generally is nominating pretty considerable numbers of women to run for the Chamber of Deputies, to run for the Senate, to run for governorships, et cetera, et cetera. I think the first major party nominee to run for president is Josefina Vasquez, I think, of the PAN in 2012. We haven't seen a woman president in Mexico yet, but the effect of these reforms has been to drastically increase the share of the share of women in Mexican politics. And today, the Mexican Congress, the legislature at the federal level, is just about 50% women. Of course, political parties will engage in a variety of attempts to circumvent these rules. There's one big scandal, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, where it's emerged that many Mexican parties are nominating women who they expect to then resign immediately after winning the election, and will be replaced by men who have just been conveniently nominated as the alternative sort of backup candidate. The political parties continue to some degree to nominate women in areas where either they know that they're going to be less competitive, so they don't feel like they're throwing away a seat that a man could have taken. Sometimes you'll see political parties kind of informally agree to nominate all women in the same district, so that women and men aren't competing against each other. And so these rules have not always been implemented in good faith, but enforcement has really increased since 1996. A lot of those loopholes have been closed, and the result has been to drastically increase the representation of women in elected office in Mexico. One last gender issue to talk about today, and that's abortion laws. Owing in part to a long tradition of social conservatism, owing to the sort of widespread acceptance of the Roman Catholic Church's position against abortion, abortion has for a long time been criminalized at the federal level in Mexico, I think since the 1930s. Mexico being a federal system, it's your state criminal laws that are a lot more important, and almost all states in Mexico criminalize abortions, with some limited exceptions in cases of rape or danger to the mother's health and a couple of other circumstances. There was a big sort of break in that facade when in 2007, the legislature in Mexico City, remember that operates more or less like a state, a little bit less autonomy, but it does have an elected legislature. The legislature in 2007 for the federal district of Mexico City decriminalized abortion in the first 12 weeks of pregnancy. That was immensely controversial. It shows you kind of the difference in social politics between Mexico City and the rest of the country. And that was kind of a watershed moment for abortion rights in Mexico. That law was challenged in the courts, but ultimately upheld by Mexico's Supreme Court. They decided that Mexico City's legislature had the power to make that change. Since then, 2 other states in Mexico have decriminalized abortion in the first trimester, but the other 29 continue to make it a crime. You will be, I think, probably unsurprised to know that banning something doesn't make it stop. It just shifts it underground. And so obviously it's hard to get really good, comprehensive, regular data on the rates of something that's widely criminalized, but illegal abortion in Mexico remains fairly common. Either through doctors who are doing it illegally or through medication. And it's worth noting that this is one area where civil society has kind of sprung up in order to meet a perceived need. There are a number of civil society groups in Mexico that have organized around the issue of abortion on both sides of the issue, some trying to lobby legislators and others trying to deliver directly access to abortion or information about abortion to women who are facing unwanted pregnancies. So just worth noting, this remains both a controversial issue in Mexico. Keep an eye out for continued change in the coming years and decades, and also an illustration of kind of the differential effects on social policy and criminal law that can be introduced under a federal system. I will leave it there. Thanks very much.